Okay, welcome everyone to week one, the second week of WOOFCODE. This week we're going to be talking about CSS, and we'll be giving a little bit more of an introduction to HTML than what we did last time. So last week's homework, you all got a little bit of experience actually programming HTML, doing a few of the really basic exercises to play around with some of these elements that we really quickly introduced last time. And I also had you play around with the Chrome developer tools, with the element inspector, the console, and the network tab. A few of you found some awesome stuff and shared it with the Discord channel. So we had this New York Times coding Easter egg inside of their development tool. I didn't see this before. One of you found a 5% discount on a e-commerce site to anything on that site, which is pretty cool. Being a little thing for hackers to, because geeks need to stick together, basically, was the wording here, which is quite cool. And then one of you found this super cool picture of a pterodactyl. I think this was some sort of a cartoon site. Check this out. Really cool stuff. A lot of the time, these messages are in some way trying to recruit people to work at whatever company is making the website. Yeah, developers are pretty in fashion, in demand. Developers are pretty in demand. So yeah, any way that you can target a message specifically to developers is quite cool. So this lecture, as I said, I just want to recap what we did last lecture. Just go over what we know about HTML. We'll learn a few other things about HTML that I didn't cover last time. But most of this lecture will be about CSS, which we're using to style our websites. So CSS, basically you can divide CSS into selectors and properties. So I'll give a little bit of introduction to both of those, what they are, how to use them. But we won't go into too much depth on CSS in this lecture. Okay, so last time we talked about HTML, this time CSS. We might be curious as to what these two things are, how different each of these things are. And we have a nice little analogy here that we can use to think of how HTML and CSS fit together in a website. We have this example of a body, like a human body here. And a human body essentially is made up of some sort of structure. So you can think of bones underneath the skin that says, okay, this is like the general shape of a person. We have a certain set of bones here, which is like a skull that makes up the head. We have certain bones like this, kind of dangling off on the side. These are like the arm bones. We have like a spine that keeps us straight. We have bones on our legs that show where our legs are. So it gives us like a rough structure of how a human being looks. You can think of that as being analogous to HTML. Here goes a heading, here goes a paragraph tag, here goes some list elements. We have like the rough structure of, okay, this goes here, this goes here. CSS, in this analogy, is kind of like clothes on top of the skeleton. If we were walking around with no clothes, then we wouldn't look as interesting or captivating as we would if we had fancy new fashion brands all over us that are making us look nice. So that's kind of the analogy for CSS. CSS is the fancy stuff on top of the raw skeleton that makes us look good and captivate other people. And then JavaScript, which we'll talk about from next lecture. We have quite a lot of JavaScript in this course. Is sort of like the moving things under the skin. So you could think of JavaScript as being like the blood flowing through arteries. You could think of JavaScript as like the muscle tendons that do something. So without JavaScript, you could say, okay, well, there's like this dead looking skeleton and we've put some clothes onto it. It's not really a human being if it can't interact and move. So all of these three things together basically make a website. And then the last piece is the content. So content could be like some words, it could be like an article, it could be some images, for example. So all of these components together make a website as a whole. And so far, we've only really looked at what this looks like in terms of free code camp, where you just kind of have this editor, this sandbox on the screen that you can play around with. But generally, an HTML site would look something like this. So these are like physical files, physical folders on your computer. And typically we'd have one project level folder. Here we're calling it HTML site. And that project folder would contain an HTML file. And it could also contain another folder where all the images are stored. It could take another folder where there's JavaScript files. But everything sort of belongs together at the same level of hierarchy. The default name for all HTML files is like sort of the entry level to your site is always index.html. The reasoning behind that is if you call something index.html and you load it up in a website, if there's nothing on the end of whatever extension you're looking at, then your browser automatically knows to go to the index.html file and try to show that. So for example, if this was the folder for facebook.com and facebook.com had an index.html file, you could go to www.facebook.com and it would sort of redirect you to facebook.com/the index.html file. So that's a little confusing. Don't worry about it right now. Just be aware that usually we're writing stuff on our computer. And usually we have some sort of file structure like this that contains everything with the site. Okay, so the first kind of section that I want to talk about today is just a little bit more about HTML. I want to give it a really quick recap on what we know about HTML from last lecture. And I have just a couple of other things that I want to talk about with HTML that I'm mentioning here. Okay, so to recap with HTML, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. The hypertext are these fancy newfangled documents that Tim Berners-Lee created in the 90s, where you might have a scientific paper that links to other scientific papers. And rather than needing to find a really specific URL for one particular scientific paper that's been hosted on some server, now we have this sort of interconnected mesh of different sites that are all hosting things for us, and we can move between them with these links. So that's hypertext. The ML stands for markup language. I didn't mention this last time, but there's a slight difference between a markup language and a programming language. A markup language talks about how something should be displayed, but it's not doing any kind of computation, which we might be doing with a programming language. So we're not trying to figure anything out. We're not trying to calculate anything. We're just saying, okay, this is broadly what this page should look like. So that's the markup language, the ML part of the HTML. So we're describing, okay, how do these hypertext documents look? It's the means of expressing ourselves through these hypertext documents. And then you might also hear of this thing called HTML5. Like the logo for HTML now has this big 5, like the 5 is more important than the HTML for some reason. This is basically just HTML. Like, don't worry about okay, I know HTML, but I don't know HTML5. It's pretty much the same. It's just this big update that came in 2014 and added a few more HTML elements that we can use. But yeah, just treat HTML5 as exactly the same as HTML. That's totally fine. And in terms of what the HTML looks like, we always have something that broadly looks like this. We have these tags. HTML is made up with these tags. And we tend to have an opening tag, a closing tag, and then some sort of content in between. In terms of what that content can actually be, we actually have this distinction between something called a standalone element and a container element. So most elements look something like this on the bottom. There's an opening tag and there's a closing tag, and we can sort of shove other things inside of these tags. So one element can contain another element. That's a container element. That's most of these HTML elements that we know about. But there are a few HTML tags that are called standalone elements. And what this means is they close themselves and they can't contain any other elements inside of them. So the two examples I could think of, I think this is pretty much the only two examples that there really are, is an image tag and a line break tag. So you can see with this image tag, we have a couple of attributes. And then we have this sort of like slash and then the end of the tag. It's all in one tag. It closes itself, so it's a self-closing tag. The same with the line break, except we don't need this other slash. I think if you use the other slash, it still works anyway. I think you used to have to use the self-closing slash, but for some reason you don't need more. This BR tag is just like a space between different things. I didn't mention all of these tags before. And I guess while we're here, this div tag. Div is a really common tag that we use just to space things out on the screen. It's short for divider. So it's like, okay, I just want this to be like a mesh of stuff that fits together. So it could be like the wrapper surrounding lots of other elements. It's sort of like just a miscellaneous tag that contains things and we can put together somewhere. But probably that makes more sense when we talk about CSS and when you actually get to use some of these tags yourselves in this week's homework together with the styling. So closely related to this idea of standalone container elements, we have this concept of nesting. We have this word called nesting that we can use. And the deal with nesting is it's basically just saying, okay, one element or many elements can be inside of other elements, specifically container elements. So it's just a little bit of vocabulary to say, okay, like this p tag here is nested inside the body tag. All HTML elements are in the end nested inside the body tag in some way. And we can have multiple elements nested inside of other multiple elements. So here we have this p tag that's nested inside this list item tag, and the list item tag needs to be nested inside the unordered list tag or ordered list tag to show up on the screen. So not too much new there, just a little bit of jargon. And really important to remember that the order of these nestings has to matter. You can think of this as like these like Russian dolls. What do you call these things? Russian doll. These Russian dolls, where there's like a little baby one that lives inside of a slightly less baby one, and then there's another one, and then they all kind of fit together. Tags that open always have to fit next to one that closes. So it can be quite easy to mess that up. If you forgot to close a tag or you close a tag in the wrong place, that can sort of mess up how the page looks. So we just have to be really clear whenever we open a tag, this one always has to match up with the last one, and then the next one has to match up with the next one, and you just kind of have to think about what's opening what and what's closing what. So incidentally, these line breaks we have here, we usually separate nested tags with a tab or a number of spaces. So either like 2 spaces or 4 spaces, or just like pressing the tab key. So we get this little bit of space before each of these. That's actually not necessary to get something to show up on the screen. Your browser in the end will just sort of screen through this whole file and just forget about all the spaces. But this is just specifically for us to make it look a bit easier, make sure we track, okay, what's opening what's at the same level. But it's a really good habit to get into, to always be using these indents whenever we can. Okay, so that's, okay, one more thing about HTML. We're gonna launch into talking about CSS. There's this idea of using both relative and absolute paths. This word gets thrown around quite a lot, so I just want to give a quick introduction to what this means. An absolute path usually starts with either HTTP or HTTPS or www. And it references a particular page or a particular picture on the internet. So in this case, we have https mysite.com/puppypic.jpg. So we're assuming that, okay, there's this website called mysite.com, and there's this JPEG file called puppypic, which belongs to this particular web page. So we can include that as an SRC attribute, and then our image tag is just gonna grab whatever's there at that particular site, and it's going to display that. So if this path starts with HTTP, or it starts with HTTPS, or it starts with www, then on HTML, our browser is going to realize, okay, this is an absolute path, and it's going to go and grab that particular file from this URL. But on the other hand, if we don't have HTTP or www or HTTPS at the start of this URL, then it's going to look in the project folder where we're located. So way back at the start, we talked about this folder structure. You know, our index.html file is literally just a file on our machine. And it's inside of this project folder. If we have a relative route, then our browser is going to look within the current folder and try to navigate itself towards that file. So in this example here, here for the image tag, we have this path of img/puppypic.jpg, and what this means is that our browser is going to look in the current directory. It's going to look for a folder called img, and then it's going to open that folder up, and then it's going to look inside that folder and try to find a file called puppypic.jpg. So whenever there's a slash, that's like, okay, go to the next level of the hierarchy. So we could imagine like a really long path to this file, and as long as it matches up with something that's in our folder, then it's going to display as expected. So that's with images. This also works the same way with links. So in HTML, a link is an anchor tag, an A tag, which is kind of confusing. Like if I was designing a hypertext markup language, I'm pretty sure I would call a link rather than calling it an anchor, because that's kind of confusing. But yeah, with an anchor, with a link, you have this attribute called href, which is basically, okay, the link that I want to go to. And yeah, we can either give it a absolute path, which is like usually something not on the same website as you. So Wikipedia, the page for Facebook, is linking to Facebook. That would be an absolute path. Or if we don't have this HTTP or HTTPS or www, then it's going to link to something inside of the same folder. So in this case, we have like an about.html page. We have like a separate file for that page. So in this case, this will just grab that file and then show that in the browser. So it still redirects you, but it's on the same site, basically. Okay, so that's the last little bit of stuff I wanted to talk about with HTML. The next thing I want to talk about is CSS. So as we described with this analogy of the body, we've got this skeleton. We know roughly what the page is going to look like. We have the kind of structure there. The CSS, again, it's about these designer clothes that's going to make our website really pop, make this website look great. And as I mentioned already, there's basically these two things we need to worry about, which is properties and selectors. So CSS, it stands for cascading style sheets. The cascading part, this is just a reference to the idea that you can sort of throw lots of these files on top of each other, and there are specific rules to decide which of these CSS declarations get applied to different things. So the idea is you've got lots of these declarations sort of falling on top of each other, cascading, and in the end you have one particular set of styles that get applied. So CSS, it's not a markup language, it's not a programming language, it's what's called a style sheet language, which I'm pretty sure is so specific that it only really applies to CSS. Like, I can't really think of many other style sheet languages out there, but that's what Wikipedia would tell you. And yeah, okay, so CSS works together with HTML a lot. Like, pretty much every website out there uses HTML and CSS, but they are slightly different technologies. So you need to link them together to get them to work. In terms of what CSS looks like, a CSS file is a big collection of what are called CSS rules. So a statement like this, a statement like this, and it defines how particular elements should appear. So we're going to do a little bit of diving into the anatomy of this, and then I'm going to explain what all of this stuff means. So connecting these two together, as I said, they're not exactly the same thing. They're two slightly different technologies. We need to actually include them in our HTML file. And there's basically three different ways that we can connect some CSS to your HTML. Inline, embedded, and external. Wherever possible, I would always try to do external CSS. I'm missing a quote mark there. Always try and do external CSS because that's the cleanest, and I'll show you what each of these look like, and we can maybe get an idea of why I would recommend external. So the first option for including CSS in an HTML file is called inline styling. And the reason it's called inline styling is because we're directly injecting some styles in the line, kind of, in the HTML line. And the way this works is we have this attribute that we can use called style in an HTML tag. And if we write style with some of these declarations, which I'll get onto, then this particular declaration will get applied directly to whichever tag we're using it on. So in this case, we're going to change the text color to red just on this particular p tag. The downside to using inline styling is that it gets really messy. If you have to create like 10 different declarations on this particular p tag, you'll end up with this really long line separated by a semicolon for each one of the declarations that we're making. And it just ends up being really messy, especially if you have like a really big file where every single element on the page is getting styled differently. We often end up repeating ourselves when we have to do this. So if at all possible, don't use inline styling. That's purely, there are reasons to use it, but I would, if at all possible, not use this at all. Another option is called embedded CSS. So in the head of an HTML file, The head, of course, this was the like first block in our HTML structure of every page, and it defines this sort of meta information that that doesn't show up on the screen. So one of the things we can define in the head is CSS files, CSS snippets. So if we use this tag called style inside of the head tag, and we give it a type of text/CSS, we can write out style declarations in the same place, and these styles will get applied to our file. So at the moment, if this is still looking a little bit confusing because we haven't really dissected this yet, don't worry. But this is one way that we can use, we can include styles in our file. Similarly to inline styling, I don't really like doing this because you end up with a really long HTML file, and it's never really clear where the styles begin and where the HTML begins and the style stops. There's this idea in computer science called separation of concerns, where you want all the things that concern one particular thing to be in one file, and all of the things that concern a different thing to be in a different file. So it's nice to have a project where all of the HTML that you're writing belongs in the HTML file, and all of the CSS that you're writing belongs in a CSS file. Then you can kind of really clearly reason about, okay, I'm in HTML mode now, I'm in my HTML file, now I'm going to switch into CSS mode, and I'm just going to write CSS. It just makes things a little bit cleaner. So that goes to the last and the best, in my opinion, way of using CSS to an HTML file. It's pretty similar to the style hack that we had for embedded. We can use this style tag inside of a head tag to inject styles for a particular HTML file, but we can also use this link tag, which links in whatever we have at this href tag. So in terms of the actual syntax for this, I've been a programmer now for like 6 years, 8 years, something like this. Whenever I'm including a style.css tag, I have to look up, okay, what was the syntax again to get this to work? Like, it makes no sense to me. It doesn't really matter. Like, you don't need to feel like you memorized this entire piece just to include a style sheet. You can just Google, okay, how do I do link CSS, and find this exact line to copy in. So this will basically just grab whatever's at this path. So this is a relative path again. It's going to look in the folder that we're in, and it's going to grab the styles.css. You can also see this sometimes in like a separate CSS folder if there are different style sheets that we want to apply. But yeah, so relative path, it will grab whatever's at this path. So in the current directory, the sheet called style.css in this case, and it will just copy and paste essentially whichever styles we have defined in style.css, and just sort of inject it into the head so it applies to the whole document. Yeah, and it's really easy to maintain for larger projects. You can kind of see, okay, all of the styles go in here, and it's just way easier than inline or embedded. Okay, so now we have an idea of how we set this up inside of a file. I want to give a really quick introduction to what these CSS rules look like. So a rule, again, is just the name for like one blob of CSS. And a CSS file is just lots of these rules, one after another. So in this slide, we have some annotations. Essentially, all CSS is doing is it's selecting some sort of category of elements on the screen using this selector. So the selector is looking in the HTML and it's saying, okay, match all the elements that match with this selector. It's grabbing hold of this selection of elements, and we're assigning to that selection some range of styles. So we have selectors, we have declarations, which is like declaring what these elements look like. And for the declarations, we're setting a particular property with a particular property value. So this is one of these stages where it's like you hear like 5 different pieces of jargon here, and it can get confusing. I wouldn't worry too much about the jargon. I would just worry about roughly being aware of what the syntax looks like. And in terms of the syntax, it's some sort of thing we call a selector. We'll talk about what these look like. It's a pair of curly braces, which is like, okay, here's what I'm going to do to the selector. And then for each of these declarations, we have some sort of property name. We have a colon, and then we have the value that we want to give to that particular property name. And each one of these gets separated by a semicolon. So again, just looking at this basic introduction, one of these rules, we might have multiple different declarations. Each of these properties is like a particular aspect of style that we care about. And we have like a range of different values that we can give to each of these properties. Okay, so here, for example, the selector is body. So we're looking for the body tag in the HTML document. And on that body, we're setting the padding left, the font family, the color, and the background color, which will give that body element a particular look, a particular style. So that's all CSS is really. And everything else that we're talking about in this lecture is just sort of fleshing out the details, the minute details of how this works. But essentially, it's just, okay, there's a selector, there's a bunch of things that we can set on our elements, and this is the way that we set one particular property with one particular value. Okay, so we have the selectors, we have the properties. These 2 things I want to talk about in sequence. So a selector, as I mentioned, okay, selector is just selecting a certain type of element on the screen. Here are like the 3 most simple types of selector that we work with. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to show some examples of what this looks like. And then we can talk about some more advanced selectors. I'm going to introduce like 6 patterns. But if you just know these 3 on the screen, then you could do pretty much anything that you would want to do with CSS. The other 3 are just to make things a little bit more precise, put more tools in your toolbox to make it a little bit easier. But these are the 3 basic ones. So with each of these, I've sort of like condensed them into one line, but you can think, okay, we have some selector, we have the curly brackets, and we have some declarations. That's all this like ... is here. That's all the tilde, that's all there's a fancy name. This is what the ellipsis is for. Okay. Okay, so we have like 3 different types of selectors here that I want you to know about. The first one, when we just have a particular name of a tag, when it's just some sequence of characters with nothing in front of it before this wiggle, this syntax is selecting on a certain type of tag. So for example, yeah, in this picture here, we have just a P as the selector, the letter P. In this case, the CSS is going to look for all paragraph tags on the page, all P tags on the page, and it's going to set the color to red. So that's what, when there's nothing in front of it, that means it's a tag name. And it's selecting all the elements that have the tag name, and it's doing something to that tag name. Next, we have a hash. A hash and then some sequence of characters is looking for an element on the screen with an ID of that particular name. So an ID is one of these attributes that we have to work with in HTML. And the kind of meaning behind an ID is we have this one particular string of characters that represents this one element. So there should only be one element per ID. So if we have one element with an ID of first, then we can't have like multiple of them. Like it should just be 1-to-1. The deal is with an ID. So it's like, okay, this particular element right here, the one I call John, I want John's background color to be red. That's the deal with an ID. Just one particular element on the screen, that's the one I'm selecting, that's the one I'm putting these styles on top of. That's the ID. And then lastly, if there's a dot before some collection of characters, then that's a class. So a class that's similar to an ID. An ID is an attribute of HTML. We put it next to our opening tag, and that's the name of that particular element. With a class, the difference is you can reuse them with multiple elements. So for example, we might have a class of blue element, and then we're trying to style that all the blue elements on the page with a background color of blue. So then we have this handy little thing where we can just put blue as the class of the element, and that deals with the blue color that we want for these particular elements for some reason. Okay, so these are the three most important ones. If you had to memorize anything from this lecture, all I would memorize is, okay, there's nothing in front of a selector, that means a tag. There's a hash mark before the selector, that means it's an ID, which is just one. And a dot before the selector is a class, which can be one or many elements on the screen that have a particular set of styles. So I have a few examples here of what this could look like with an actual HTML file and a CSS file. I'm just going to walk through how these look differently between different selectors. We have an HTML file that has 3 paragraph tags, and we've given them a selection of different attributes that will be used for the CSS. So the ID, again, an ID is just one particular type of element. We've given an ID to all 3 of these. We have one that's called first, one that's called middle, one that's called last. And the 2 on the outside, the first one and the last one, we've given a class called outer. So the first example I'm talking about here, in our CSS, we're using the selector of just P. So this, because it doesn't have anything before it, this matches the tag name of P. So we're saying, okay, every P tag in our HTML, we have like this, grab this selection of all the P tags. So it's like, okay, grab like all 3 of these P tags, and we're applying a text color of white and a background color of black. So this is what we end up with, like all 3 of the paragraph tags get this particular styling. In the next example here, we're doing an ID selection. So I'm just saying, I'm saying a hash before the name of the selector. So hash always means an ID. So that's just one particular element with this particular name. So what this does here is it looks inside of the HTML file. It finds the element with the ID of first, which is the first one here, and applies these styles just to that first paragraph tag. So this is what we get on the right. Again, ID selection just looks for one. Okay, now it's called middle. This is the one that's middle, the one in the middle. So that's how that works. Grab that particular style, grab that selector, and apply these style declarations to it. Last, same thing. Now it's looking for the last one. Then we have this class selection. So because there's a dot before the name of the tag, now we know it's selecting a class. So in this case, we look through the HTML, we find all elements that match this class called outer. So that's this one and it's this one. And we're applying these styles just to those 2. So last example is just the outer 2 elements. So if you're wondering, like, why do we bother with class and ID? Why don't we just call all of these why don't we just use classes? You know, why do we bother having this distinction between class and ID? The programming principle behind this is something called "don't repeat yourself." This pops up quite a lot. It's kind of a really good explanation for lots of these rules that we have, lots of these design patterns for programming. So the idea is, okay, we could write something like this. We could have one ID tag for every single ID on the page, and we could write out our styles like this, declaring everything as we want. But it's infinitely better if we can use something more general. So just using this this P selector here instead of using 3 different rules for different selectors. It's way better because if we write it like we have on the left, then if we suddenly decide, okay, I want to change the background color suddenly to green, then we don't need to go through every single ID and change each one. We can just change it in one particular place, and it has the same effect. So that's just way better. It makes fewer errors to have to manage changes between, like 10 different tags versus 1 tag. And it's also just way cleaner. So you're writing less code, and that means that less can go wrong because there are a few places where you could forget a curly brace or something, or forget a semicolon. So we always want to try and reuse code wherever we can. And using a class or using a tag selector means that we have few places that we can go wrong, and we're saying the same thing in less lines of code, which is always really good. So that's something to bear in mind. It will pop up later in the course. I'll be talking about don't repeat yourself. There's also like a what do you call this? There's a nice little word that we use to describe code that's written really well, which is dry code, DRY code, don't repeat yourself code. This is opposed to something called wet code, which is write every time. We don't want our code to be wet. We want our code to be dry. We don't want to repeat ourselves in the code that we write. So this is a great solution to try and help us to do that, essentially. So the last few CSS selectors that I want to mention, as I mentioned, like really not at all required to know how all of these work. Even if you want to use them but need to look up the exact syntax later, that's totally fine. But these are some more selectors that are sometimes useful. But as I mentioned, just with these ones, you can do absolutely everything that you need to do with CSS. It's just that it could be every now and then it's easier if you want to use one of these ones as well. It can also be a dry thing of not wanting to repeat yourself too much. So the last few selectors, if we have one selector and then a space and then another selector, in this case this is 2 IDs, but it could be anything. It could be a P tag here and then a class here. That's also okay. The pattern here is that we're going to be selecting elements that match the second selector, which are inside of, nested directly inside of the element with the first selector. So here in our HTML, we're going to be searching for the element with the ID of name2. And we're only going to apply these styles to it if it's a child component of an element with the ID of name1. So that's the kind of one selector, then a space, then another selector. The next one here is when you have a selector, then a comma, and then another selector. That's saying, okay, apply these styles to this group of elements and this group of elements. So I want to apply a set of styles to both the element with the ID of name1 and all of the elements with a class of name2. So that's just a really quick way of sort of not having to write more of these statements. So that's nice and dry, as we mentioned. So that's good. And then finally, when we have a class, where so we have like, okay, dot one class and then dot another class. In this case, we want to apply these styles to only elements that have both of these classes on in the tag, in the class attribute. So to make an element with 2 classes, what you do is write in the HTML a a particular value for the class. So we might say, okay, outer, and then a space, and then another class. So that applies more than one class to one particular HTML element. So that's how we do that. We didn't really mention this in these slides, but I think you'll have some practice at this in the homework. Okay, so that's the other three that you might want to know about. There are technically some more of these CSS selectors, but I really never use these. I think you can pretty much do anything if you just know these 6. And as I said, if you just know the top 3, then this is like 80% of all styling you'll need to do, is just knowing, okay, if there's nothing in front of it, that's a tag. If there's a hash, that's an ID. If there's a dot, that's a class. That's pretty much everything you really need to know with CSS. And for the homework, I basically just want you to start using those 3. We can already get like a good way through with just that. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about today, particularly about CSS, is properties. So again, going back to this anatomy, we have the selector. Okay, grab these elements from the page. The properties are like the particular things that we can style our elements with. So a property is like the name of the thing that we're styling, and then the property value is the value that we're giving to the thing. So maybe this sounds a little bit abstract, but we're going to go through a few examples of properties that we can use. The whole thing is called a declaration. Like one line of a CSS rule is a declaration, because we're declaring a particular property to have a particular value. And just by saying it, just magically makes it so. Okay. So properties, yes. So the first thing I want to talk about, it pops up quite a bit, is coloring in CSS. I have the same example that we used earlier. Again here, just using the P selector, so all the paragraph tags. I'm giving some styles to it. It's fairly self-explanatory, but this kind of gets confusing. The color always relates to the text color. So here we're saying, okay, color of white is coloring the text in white. The background color is the background. So I constantly make this mistake of trying to just, okay, I want this box to be black. I'm going to put the color as black. It doesn't do anything. And it turns out, okay, I really need the background color, for instance. There are a few different colors that we can use for this. There are a few different ways that we can call these colors. I have 3 examples here. There are actually even more ways that we can call colors. These are all the things that you could write in the value. So, color is the name of the property. We can say a few different things for the value to make the color appear. One way of doing this is to say the name of a color. So I think there's a bunch of colors that come kind of pre-packaged with our browser that the browser knows about. So if you write a color of red or a color of green, our browser can figure that out. For more specific colors, we can use either an RGB value or a hex code value. You probably didn't hear about these things before, or maybe you're vaguely aware of these things before. But there's a really useful coloring system that we can use to get pretty much any color. The deal is every color can be expressed in terms of a percentage of red, a percentage of green, and a percentage of blue. So you can imagine like a pixel is sort of like this, these 3 lights together, where one of them is red, one of them is green, and one of them is blue. And if you have lots of these pixels together, you can essentially make a color appear from just turning some of these squares on and off with different colors. If that sounds confusing, then I'm also a little bit confused by that. But just know that if you add a few of these colors together, red, green, and blue, you can essentially make any color from the sum. So it turns out if you have no red, no green, and no blue, that ends up being black. If you have all red, all green, and all blue, that ends up being white. If you have all red, no green, no blue, it's perfectly red. If you have no red, all green, no blue, it's perfectly green. And if it's no red, no green, all blue, it's perfectly blue. And you can make all the colors in between by just kind of moving these numbers up and down. One way to see this for yourself, if you just type in color picker into Google, there's this nice little tool where you can pick any color and move this circle around, and it'll give you the hex code and the RGB code, which is quite nice. In terms of the hex code, this is actually expressing the same thing that we have with the RGB code, except it's a little bit more succinct. The deal with hex is that there's a number system that isn't digits. So it's not like, it doesn't go up to 10, it goes up to 16. And it looks something like this. Like you have groups of two numbers, which translates to a number between 0 and 255. And each one is expressing a particular color value for red, green, and blue. So here we have FF, that's like the number 255 in hexadecimal. So FF0000 is totally red. 0000FF is totally blue. And then FFFFF is totally white. So that's probably going to be kind of confusing, but don't worry about it. All you need to know is there are some particular sets of digits. You can get it from Google, and you can express pretty much any color in hexadecimal or in RGB, and it looks something like this. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is a property that we can set with CSS is how we position elements on the screen. This is quite an important thing. In CSS, all elements are essentially boxes. So all HTML elements, our browser can sort of think about them as a box. So there's this thing that's somewhere on the screen. It has like a fixed height. It has a fixed width. And it has a few other properties to this box that shows how big it is and how it gets displayed. So I'll go through each one of these in order. So you can actually see this box model at work in the element inspector. If you scroll down to the bottom of this, the HTML and CSS code that gets rendered for a particular element, you can see this thing here, which I've enlarged here. And this is just kind of an illustration of how this box model works. And you can see how it relates to the content on the screen as well. So in the case of this particular element here, we have a padding of 24 on the left and 24 on the right. The size of the box, the internal content, is 472 pixels by 62. So that's a width of 472 and then a height of 62. We also have a 2-pixel bottom margin on this element. And yeah, and that's pretty, oh no, the 2-pixel border on the bottom, but no margin. So that's how to read this box. So in terms of each of these one by one, first off, there's something called padding. So the content you can think of, okay, what is in this HTML element? You know, if we have a paragraph tag and then we have some text, the text is the content. Alternatively, it could be other HTML elements that are nested inside of the tag. So padding is like some internal buffer on the outside of the content, but inside of the margin and inside of the border. So we can set this padding a few different ways. There's a CSS property called padding, which works kind of funnily. I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. But padding sort of sets multiple sides of the box as padding at once. So here, if we just use a value of 15 pixels, then that's saying, okay, top, left, bottom, and right padding. I want all of these to be 15 pixels, so we have like a little ring around the box. We can also set like a particular type of padding to a value. So here, if we say padding dash top, then it's just the top padding that I want to set here. We also have padding dash left, padding dash right, and padding dash bottom. So that's the whole side, all sides of the box. And if we use multiple of these values separated by a space for the padding property, then we get this sort of really weird selection where it starts at the top and then it goes right, then it goes bottom, then it goes left. It's always that order. I don't know why it's that order. It's kind of a clumsy order to put things in my opinion. So here we'd read this as, okay, 10 pixels on the top, 5 pixels on the right, 3 pixels on the bottom, 5 pixels on the left. Don't worry about memorizing this. This will come in time. When you have less than 4 values, it sort of wraps around. So the padding value is always going top, right, bottom, left, like a clockwise circle. And if we don't have 4 of these, it wraps around. So if we have 2 values, then it sets the top, top with the first one, right with the second one, bottom with the first one, left with the second one. I think that was right. If we have 3, then it would go top, right, second one, third one, bottom, first one, left. And it also works the same way if there's just 1, then it just wraps around with the same value. Probably that was kind of confusing, but don't worry about it for now. We can also just stick to the simpler way of just setting each one at one time. And as I said, don't worry about any of this trying to memorize anything. You'll always be able to look these values up. Next, we have the border. So the border is like a thin little edge around the box. You can make it a certain size and you can make it a certain color. With borders, there's always this like 3-spaced thing setting the border property. The first thing is the thickness. So it's a number of pixels in width of the border. So here we have a 1-pixel border. It'll be like a really thin border on the outside. The second is like the style of border. So by default, you just want to say solid for this. It's like a solid line around the outside. You can also have dotted, which is like a dotted border, or you can have dashed, which is like a dashed border. And then finally, there's the color. So here, this is red. This is all red, no green, no blue. This is in hex. Can also use just the name of the color. Can also use the RGB value, just the same. And similarly to the padding, we can set the border of the entire box, or we can also set the top border, left border, right border, bottom border, using this dash notation. Okay, next we have the margin, the last thing about the box model. And the margin is really similar to the padding, except the margin goes outside the box. So it's sort of this buffer between the edge of the border and the next element on the screen. The difference between using margin and padding is that if you set a padding, it increases the total size of the box by whatever the padding is. So if you had, let's say, like a 300 pixel square box and you had a 10 pixel padding all the way around it, then the height would be 320 by 320. If you did the same with a margin, then the box would still be 300 by 300, but you'd have this sort of like jutting space around each side pushing against the surroundings. So that's the difference. Sometimes you use margin, sometimes you use padding. You can typically always make things just in terms of padding, just by adding another wrapper around whatever you're using. But just be aware, okay, there's padding, there's also margin. And the margin you set in exactly the same way as you set the padding. So it's this really weird convoluted system where it's like it's going around in a clockwise direction from the top. If you just use the word margin, or you can also set a particular edge of the margin with margin top, left, bottom, or right. Okay, so that's positioning things in terms of the box model. Another thing to know about in terms of positioning elements is floats. So there's a property called float, and if you don't set it, then by default, most HTML elements will break a new line when you put two elements together. So for example, you could say, okay, well, let's say we have a title, which is just my title, my website or something. And then you have some text in a p tag underneath it with some lorem text, some junk that's that you want to display on your site. By default, this will sort of wrap around to a new line. Lots of times that's a nice default behavior, but sometimes you'll want things to be sort of side by side on the screen. And the way you do that is to use a float. So setting the float to the value of either left or right means that this particular element is going to sort of like shift to the left of its container. So it goes outside of the usual positioning system that we use for CSS, and whatever else is defined below it will just sort of wrap around it. So we can see this example here. The p tag that we defined after this box is just wrapping around it and coming up. So that's useful if we want to have something where one page has like content on the left and there's content on the right, like sort of side by side. We'll use floats to do that typically. Last thing with positioning, and I think the last thing that I want to talk about with CSS in general, there's this awesome set of properties called Flexbox, which is super useful. And the idea with a Flexbox is that you have containers and items. And if you set a particular element as a container, as a flex container, it sort of gives you a way to space out elements on the page up and down. So before we had Flexbox, this was a really difficult task, especially for centering things like vertically on a screen. Because we never really know how tall a page is. We always know how wide a page is, but we don't know how tall it is for some reason. And yeah, with a Flexbox, you can just get around this problem and say, okay, I want 4 different elements. I want this element to take up as much space as it possibly can, or I want them to stay in this particular ratio, or I want them to have equal padding between them. So Flexbox is a super useful set of tools for defining how elements are spaced on the page. This is kind of complex to figure out, but I'm going to leave a really nice article in the homework this week that explains Flexbox. And there's also a great game that I have in the homework this week where you can space things out on a page using Flexbox. And there are little frogs that you want to put on lily pads. It's a really cool game, and it sort of helps you get good at using these Flexbox styles. So this was just a few of these CSS properties, but there's a whole boatload of them. I'm going to put this link as well in the homework this week in case anyone's curious. But as I said, I wouldn't worry too much about memorizing any of this stuff. Google is always your friend as a developer. If you want to figure out how to do something, just put it into Google. There'll be a link to one of these pages which defines how you should use it. And being good as a developer is always just knowing what to Google, being able to Google it well, and then being able to read what you Googled and make it work. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about today, you might have heard of this word responsive design. In general, we always want to design websites that can be used on anything. So I think the stat's been out for ages now that most people access most websites with phones. I think something like over 50% of web traffic to most sites comes from phones these days. So you don't want to only have a site that works for a desktop. You ideally want to be able to have a site that works across multiple different screen sizes. And it's possible to make your own way of handling this using positioning, using the box model, using Flexbox. But what almost everybody I know who works as a front-end dev will do is use a CSS library that gives us a set of tools for positioning things on a page for us and making sure that everything looks nice. So one of the most famous ones we have that you might have heard of is called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap is a CSS library where you can automatically have a set of grids that you can use to space things out. So rather than having to yourself figure out, okay, if this screen is this particular size, then I should have, you know, like everything on one line, or like split it into two and stuff like this. You can use this Bootstrap grid system, which kind of separates the screen into 12 slots. And depending on which class you give a particular element, some of these pre-made classes that come with Bootstrap, it'll take up a certain number of columns. And then you can make different behavior for different size screens. So if you wanted to get more deep with CSS, rather than trying to memorize like hundreds of different CSS selectors and try and make things all totally by yourself, I would much rather recommend using a CSS library. I think with the longer homework this week, we'll have a little try of using something like Bootstrap or Materialize as a different one. And you can make some websites that look really nice using these custom libraries. So in terms of what this looks like, as I said, you've got your regular HTML. You'll include the Bootstrap library in the head of the document, the same way you'd include a regular CSS file. And by giving your elements these like weird looking classes, like col MD0 and MD8 in this case, then that's saying, okay, from medium-sized screens and upwards, I want it to take up 8 out of 12 of the rows, the columns on the screen. So this is a col MD8, takes up 8 out of 12. This is a col MD4, this takes up 4 of them. So yeah, if you do the bonus homework this week, you can play around with this. You can make some really nice websites. The main thing with Bootstrap and with these CSS component libraries in general is that you can make lots of these like beautiful looking pages. Like all of these elements, it's just a case of adding like a really simple class onto your existing elements. And it gets loads of different CSS declarations that somebody else already declared. So for example, this button right here, you know, if you click on it, then there'll be like a lovely ripple effect. It'll look like a real button because it'll sort of like go down a little bit when you click it. Like all of these elements have been designed by, you know, super developers, super designers, put a lot of thought into how everything should work. And rather than having to do this work ourselves, we can just directly start using other people's work in our own code. So this is this whole abstraction thing again. You know, we don't need to know how the car's engine works. We just need to know, okay, here's the steering wheel. Here's how we use these particular classes in our file and how it works out the box. So yeah, I'd totally recommend doing this rather than getting too in the nitty gritty of making sure that you can do absolutely everything totally by yourself. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to cover today. As I said, mostly CSS, a little bit more HTML. In this week's homework, I'm going to be including some more of these free code camp exercises, the kind of development sandbox to get you practicing some of these CSS properties by yourself. I have 2 games that I want you to play. So I mentioned this one game where you can get an introduction to Flexbox. There's another one that has general introduction to CSS. I would really recommend playing with this. It's sort of like a really fun game to play around with, but I'll probably put this in the extra homework this week. But if you do 30 minutes of it, it's going to feel like fun, not feel like work, so I'm not too stressed. And then finally, there'll be a more involved project with the extra homework as well to get you to play around with styling and actually make a full website. Okay, so that's everything for this class. Homework will be due as usual by the start of next lecture. And I'll see you next week.